Nigel Farage said that he supported Germany's democratic decision to remove all statues of Hitler, for example, and that he personally agreed with that. He wouldn't make the same commitment on Colston. What is your view? I mean, was Germany right, in your view, to remove all statues of Hitler?
Of course it was, and that was a contemporaneous event. People removed statues of Hitler immediately in the aftermath of his terrible, horrific, fascistic reign. I think it's different when we're looking at statues that have stood for 200, 300 years.
So do you personally think... OK, but do you personally think Colston... Nigel Farage said if it was a democratic decision, which they tried to do in Bristol, but it's got nowhere. But if there was a democratic decision to remove it, would you support the removal of, say, Colston or Milligan's statues based on their history as slave owners and slave traders? What did you feel personally about that?
I think there's a line that we can draw here with regard to how people are remembered. I mean, we're looking today at protesters, for example, saying that we should tear down statues of Francis Drake or James II or Horatio Nelson. I don't think that that is entirely appropriate. However, when it's people who are primarily remembered for horrific deeds or for slavery, there's perhaps more nuance there. But obviously, this is something that we shouldn't do in a rash way. We shouldn't do in a quick way, and we shouldn't do in a way that is...
Okay,
well, can I just say, so Tom Harwood, if there was a statue still existing of Hitler anywhere in the world, are you saying you would only support it being taken down if there was a democratic vote? And if a group of protesters went and tore down a statue of one of the most hated people in history, you wouldn't have supported it?
I think this is a reductio ad absurdum. We are looking at this country, at statues in this country. Of course, if there were a statue of Hitler in this country, I would be one of the first people calling for it to be removed.
OK, and if a group of protesters then went and removed it, would you say you shouldn't have done that because you should have waited for a vote of the council?
I would have hoped that councils would have removed it in the first place. I think that when we get into tricky territory is when we say that sort of vigilantism on the street trumps democratic politics. I think it's right to question the Labour Council in Bristol. I think it's right to question the Labour Mayor in Bristol for why they didn't talk about this statue earlier and remove it earlier. But I'm not sure the precedent of people going and taking justice into their own hands is a good one.
How did you feel then? I asked again Nigel Farage this question, but how did you feel, for example, like Nigel Farage, I opposed the Iraq war, but I can't pretend I wasn't, pretty pleased to see Iraqi citizens who'd been oppressed by him rip down his statue in what was a very defining moment because it showed the world Saddam had actually lost control when he was pretending he was winning the war. I mean, did you honestly, be honest now, did you look at that footage and think this is a bad thing?
No, of course I didn't. It was completely right to tear down that statue in a contemporaneous setting. This is the fundamental difference.
No, but the contemporaneous setting at the moment is that Black Lives Matter, Tom Harwood.
Of course they do. Of course Black Lives Matter.
The contemporaneous moment, Tom Harwood, is that the George Floyd footage happened just 2 weeks ago. Anyone who watched that footage, black or white, doesn't matter where you're from, could not have looked at it. I'm sure you did. I think you said this. It was horrific. We know this, right? But you see, you're making an interesting distinction between you think it's right if it's contemporaneous, and yet what people in Bristol would say is this just happened, and now we've now had a light shone on the fact that we have a slave owner, slave trader statue standing over us like some white supremacist, and we want to get rid of it. I think it's a tenuous thing to say that because it's not as contemporaneous as the atrocity just happening, that it shouldn't have the same logic applied to it.
People feel it's utterly contemporaneous.
Yes, of course, and you're picking the most contentious example, and that's quite right. This is probably a statue that we can have a very serious discussion about. But let's look at the precedent this is setting, and let's look at statues of, for example, Nelson, of, for example, James II, of, for example, Robert Peel. These are all people that are not primarily known for being involved in slavery. They're people that have...
Yeah, and I think you're making a good point. I want to bring in Kendi. I think you're making a good point. When they target, Kendi, Andrew, when people target Churchill or Nelson or these great heroes to many people in this country, I think they lose support, and therefore it becomes slightly self-defeating. Let me ask you about two Nelsons. Kehinde. Lord Nelson, many people calling for that statue to be removed, but there's the statue of Nelson Mandela in Parliament Square. Nelson Mandela, for a very long time, was considered a criminal. He served 27 years in prison. He was viewed as a terrorist by many people. He openly admitted, I'm no saint. I did things which I think were wrong. I wasn't perfect, et cetera, et cetera. In many ways, to many people, a tainted hero. And yet the overall picture of Mandela is that he was a magnificent figure who actually did magnificent things. So where is that line? Would you remove Lord Nelson's statue? And if you would, by the same logic, would you remove Nelson Mandela's?
I mean, are we really going to cheapen the debate and compare Nelson Mandela to slave traders? I mean, Lord Nelson was also involved in the slave trade as well. These are very different things. I mean, the history you talk about, the people who didn't like Mandela, that was essentially racism. Mandela was never a terrorist. He was somebody who fought for freedom. I mean, you can just not compare the two.
Well, he used violence. And listen, I rate Mandela along with Churchill. Well, hang on, let me finish, Candy. Let me finish what I'm saying. I rate Mandela along with Churchill as the two greatest people of my lifetime. I had the pleasure of meeting him. He was a remarkable man, and he came out as a man of peace, but he went into prison as a man who advocated violence for political ambition, and he's admitted himself that he did that. So my point is, you can construct a negative about Mandela as you can about Churchill and others. Where is that line?
Well, I just want to really point this out that the two people you mentioned, Winston Churchill and Lord Nelson, are both famous for what? Violence. I mean, levels of violence which pale in comparison to the small amounts of violence that Mandela committed. I mean, the key thing about this is, what is the history that we want to remember? Statues are not about history. You don't learn history from walking around the street. You learn history from schools, etc. It's what is the version of history we want to present. And do you want a version of history which is slave traders, colonialists, murderers, fascists? Is that what you want in your public space? That's the debate that we're having. And I think it is a high time that we get rid of these statues. However we get rid of them. Yeah. Because it's not like these campaigns have been going for years. And it's time. Sometimes, if you want to make an omelette, you have to crack some eggs.
Would you want to get rid of Churchill's statue then, Kehinde?
I think Churchill did some good, certainly. But let's be honest, Churchill's also responsible for the deaths of millions of black and brown people. Churchill was a eugenicist. In fact, Churchill and Hitler probably would have agreed on many things when it comes to race.
Come on, Kehinde. You see, this is the trouble, Kehinde. When you say, we've had this debate before, and this is where you don't just lose me, you lose the vast majority of the British public. To try and equate Churchill to Hitler is deeply offensive to people.
It's not deeply. I'm sorry. That's one of the things we don't understand about the racism of the Nazis. Eugenics, University of Central London, where they'll be tearing down statues soon. Churchill was a member of it, was believed in eugenics, and actually those beliefs that led to the extermination of the Jews were not that different than the beliefs that led to the slavery of us. They came from the same place. So actually there are far more continuities than we'd like to, and we have to understand it. And that's
Winston Churchill stood up. Winston Churchill, sorry, forgive me for interrupting, but I've got to defend Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, when this country was threatened with the greatest threat to its civilization we ever had, from Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and when it looked like the odds were insurmountable, he almost single-handedly rallied this country to defeat the most racist person there's ever been. So to try, again, I can paint a picture to you, no, but that's why I said to you, you can paint a negative picture of the early life of Nelson Mandela too. Many people did. No, but Kehinde, I'm not equating them, but when you're going to equate Churchill to Hitler, you're making an equivalence which I find offensive too.
But it's not offensive. It's the reality that actually, if you look at eugenics and look at his views at the time and look at the views of the Nazis at the time and why the Nazis were able to come to power, is because the idea of racial science, of eugenics, was quite popular in Europe and America. It wasn't so separate, and actually Churchill was one of those people. And I think this is one of those interesting moments because it's very easy to say, look, George Floyd's killing was terrible. We all saw that. It's bad. It's America. But we have to have some real conversations about racism in this country. And that does mean looking at people like Churchill differently. And honestly,
but you're not prepared. See, what's interesting is you're not prepared, and I say this respectfully, because I want to have a nuanced debate about this, but you're not prepared, it seems to me, to accept any criticism of Mandela, even though Mandela himself criticised himself and said, I wasn't a saint. He criticised his own, he used violence for political motivation. Now, I actually think it was, if you look at Mandela in totality, he's a great man. like Churchill. But it's interesting to me that you're not prepared to countenance any criticism of Mandela, but you are prepared to equate Churchill to Hitler. And that's where I think there's no... that shows to me your view of it is skewed.
No, believe me, Piers, I'm a bigger critic of Mandela than you are. In fact, I think that one of the reasons we deify Mandela is because he went away from violence, which was probably necessary, interestingly. I'm not making this about violence or non-violence. And your defense of Churchill is that he was violent and got rid of Hitler. The question here is about racism, about the views that they had about society and what kind of world we want. And honestly, Winston Churchill did not want an equal society. He was a racist, he was a eugenicist, he was deeply classist.